Okay. Hello. Good evening. Thank you for coming. It's so nice to finally welcome Rebecca Makkai to the University of Chicago. Rebecca is one of Chicago's most well-known novelists and most active literary citizens, so I'm really glad she agreed to come here for our Fictions and Forms reading series. So I want first to describe The Great Believers to you. This is her third novel and her fourth book, and it was easily my favorite novel last year. I really enjoyed it. The big story it tells is the story of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and the carnage it brings to the gay community. And it focuses on a museum development director in Chicago who sees his closest friends in the city dying one by one, and the terror that grips the community as they negotiate the brutal, unprejudiced nature of the disease itself and the deeply prejudiced nature of how society handles it. The many strands of this story overlap with an equally compelling one in 2015, where a middle-aged woman from that narrative in 80s Chicago is now searching desperately in Paris for her estranged daughter, even as she still struggles with the devastating loss of her family and friends from the AIDS epidemic decades before. Now, into this very dramatic set of events, Rebecca brings yet another big story, the community of brilliant, world-changing artists that came out of 1920s Paris and the devastation of World War I. And I think among the many thematic strains in this novel is this idea of how these quote-unquote big stories, these enormous historical and cultural periods, are animated not merely by the topic that frames them, like war or disease or art or what have you. I think they are actually animated by the complex human relationships that always become that much more complex when unprecedented death and loss take place. In The Great Believers, the characters, and there are so many brilliantly realized and interesting characters, they're defined not by their sexuality or AIDS or death, but by their negotiation of failed romantic and familial and platonic love, of questions of loyalty and morality and mortality. For example, what is a deeper loss? Losing someone to a tragic death or losing someone through betrayal or misunderstanding? How do you remember them? How do you define them to yourself or to others after they're gone? I think what I enjoyed so much about The Great Believers is not only that it tackles these and so many more compelling and important questions, but that it made me believe so much in its characters. I rarely read a book with this many characters and they come alive that much to me and make me so deeply invested in all their struggles. Now, Rebecca's first three books were critically acclaimed in their own right, but I think The Great Believers was something else last year. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. I'm going to go through a list here. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, along with being one of New York Times' top 10 books of 2018, which is like a major prize now in and of itself. It also won the ALA Carnegie Medal, the LA Times Book Prize, the Stonewall Award, and the Chicago Review of Books Award. Her books have been translated into 14 languages. Her short fiction has been anthologized in many of the most prestigious anthologies in the country. Rebecca received her MA in Literature from Middlebury College's Breadloaf School of English, and she is on the MFA faculties of Sierra Nevada College and Northwestern University. And she is also Artistic Director of Story Studio Chicago, which has really grown, and this is a really great alternative for people who are not, say, in an academic program and would really like not just creative writing instruction, but a community of creative writers in Chicago. Let me also say that along with being an inexhaustible teacher, I think at one point I remember you telling me that you were teaching 5 classes or 5 different places.
Yeah.
That's just crazy. But along with being an inexhaustible teacher, Rebecca is an inexhaustible literary presence. All over the country, especially in Chicago, the literary community here she constantly champions. She is generous with her time hosting and interviewing all kinds of writers, contributing to all kinds of literary events. It's what it means to be a literary citizen. I also don't know how she does all this and manages to be writer, teacher, wife, mother, and a public figure. But anyway, I'm incredibly proud of her and for all of her success, and I'm grateful to her for her support and friendship. Please say hello to Rebecca Makkai.
Okay, I'm just going to disappoint you now, so I'll go home. I really appreciate that introduction. That's lovely. And sometimes I'm one of those people who I feel like sometimes I'm bugging people by inviting them to things and trying to do stuff. And that might be the case, but it's nice to know that it can be perceived other ways also. So what I'm going to do, I know that some of you who might be planning to come tomorrow might have read the first chapter already. So I am going to read a little bit from the first chapter of The Great Believers, but then I'm going to read from elsewhere in the book too. But what I'd like to do is read actually the end of the first chapter. And the setting here, you already heard, it's set kind of in Lakeview, Boys Town, Chicago in the 80s. We have a character named Yale Tishman. He's in his early 30s. And he's in charge of acquisitions and development for a small art gallery at Northwestern University. I very craftily renamed the Block Museum the Brigg Museum so that no one would figure out what I was. I didn't want to write about actual people doing, because some untoward stuff happens there. But that's where he is. He's when the novel opens, he's at a memorial service. His friend Nico is his first close friend to die of AIDS. This is 1985. So for context, this is a time when something like 16,000 people have died of the disease in the US. Ronald Reagan has not yet said the word AIDS in public. So it feels very much like people are screaming into a void. Yale and his friends and Nico's lover and friends have been specifically uninvited to the actual memorial happening, the funeral happening in a different part of the city. So they're holding their own memorial at the house of their friend Richard. He's kind of a wealthier guy. This is Lincoln Park, nice house. And the one other thing you need to know here, I promise becomes important later, is they've been drinking Cuba Libres at the party, so rum and Coke. And right when we start, there's about to be a slideshow of Nico's life. Yale couldn't bear to join, and although he wouldn't be the only one crying, he didn't think he could stay here. He backed out of the crowd and took a few steps up Richard's stairs, watching the heads from above. Everyone stared at the slides, riveted. Nico in running shorts, a number pinned to his chest. Nico and Terrence leaning against a tree, both giving the finger. Nico in profile with his orange scarf and black coat, a cigarette between his lips. Suddenly there was Yale himself, tucked in the crook of Charlie's arm, Nico on the other side, the year-end party last December for Charlie's paper. Nico had been the graphic designer for Out Loud Chicago, and he had a regular comic strip there, and he just started designing theater sets too. Nico laughing at Julian and Teddy, the Halloween they had dressed as Sonny and Cher. Nico opening a present. Nico holding a bowl of chocolate ice cream. Nico up close, teeth shining. The last time Yale saw Nico, he'd been unconscious, with foam, some kind of awful white foam oozing suddenly from his mouth and nostrils. Terrence had screamed into the hallway for the nurses, had run into a cleaning cart and hurt his knee, and the fucking nurses were more concerned about whether or not Terrence had shed blood than about what was happening to Nico. And here on the slide was Nico's full, beautiful face, and it was too much. Yale dashed up the rest of the stairs. He worried the bedrooms would be full, but the first, at least, was empty. He closed the door and sat on the bed. It was dark out now, the sparse streetlights of Belden just barely illuminating the walls and floor. Yale put his glass down and lay back to stare at the ceiling and do the slow breathing trick Charlie had taught him. All fall, he'd been memorizing the list of the gallery's regular donors. Tuning out the downstairs noise, he did what he often did at home when he couldn't sleep. He named donors starting with A, one starting with B. Recently, he'd found the list disconcerting, had felt a dull gray uneasiness around it. He remembered being 8 and asking his father who else in the neighborhood was Jewish. Are the Rothmans Jewish? Are the Andersons? And his father rubbing his chin, saying, let's not do that, buddy. Historically, bad things happen when we make lists of Jews. It wasn't until years later that Yale realized this was a hang-up unique to his father, to his brand of self-loathing. But Yale had been young and impressionable, and maybe that's why the reciting of names chafed. Or maybe it was this. Lately, he'd had 2 parallel mental lists going, the donor list and the sick list. The people who might donate art or money, and the friends who might get sick. The big donors, the ones whose names he'd never forget, and the friends he'd already lost. But they weren't close friends, the lost ones, until tonight. They'd been acquaintances, friends of friends, like Nico's old roommate, Jonathan, a couple of gallery owners, one bartender, the bookstore guy. There were, six? 6 people he knew of, people he'd say hi to at a bar, people whose middle names he couldn't tell you, and maybe not even their last names. He'd been to 3 memorials, but now a new list, 1 close friend. Yale and Charlie had gone to an informational meeting last year with a speaker from San Francisco. He'd said, I know guys who've lost no one, groups that haven't been touched, but I also know people who've lost 20 friends, entire apartment buildings devastated. And Yale, stupidly, desperately, had thought maybe he'd fall into that first category. It didn't help that through Charlie he knew practically everyone in Boys Town. It didn't help that his friends were all overachievers, and they seemed to be overachieving in this terrible new way as well. How had Yale forgotten he hated rum? It always made him moody, dehydrated, hot, his stomach a mess. He found a closet-sized bathroom off this room and sat on the cool toilet, head between his knees. So he thinks about some stuff there that is not totally relevant to this section. So I'm going to skip it, but he's been there for a while in the bathroom. That's what you need to know. And then there was the list of acquaintances already sick, hiding the lesions on their arms but not their faces, coughing horribly, growing thin, waiting to get worse, or lying in the hospital or flown home to die near their parents, to be written up in their local papers as having died of pneumonia. Just a few right now, but there was room on that list. When Yale finally moved again, it was to cup water from the sink, splash it over his face. He looked frightful in the mirror, rings under his eyes, skin gone pale olive. His heart felt funny, but then his heart always felt funny. The slideshow must be over, and if he could look down on the crowd, he'd be able to spot Charlie. They could make their escape. They could get a cab even, and he could lean on the window. When they got home, Charlie would rub his neck and insist on making him tea. He opened the door to the hall and heard a collective silence, as if they were all holding their breath, listening to someone make a speech. Only he couldn't quite hear the speech. He looked down, but there was no one in the living room. They'd moved somewhere. He came downstairs slowly, not wanting to be startled. A sudden noise would make him vomit. But down in the living room was just the whir of the record, spinning past the last song, the needle arm retired to the side. Beer bottles and Cuba Libre glasses, still half full, covered the tables and couch arms. The trays of canapes had been left on the dining table. Yale thought of a raid, some kind of police raid, but this was a private residence, and they were all adults, and nothing much illegal had happened. Probably someone had some pot, but come on. How long had he been upstairs? Maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30. He wondered if he could have fallen asleep on the bed, if it was 2 a.m. now. But no, not unless his watch had stopped. It was only 5:45. He was being ridiculous, and they were out in the backyard. Places like this had backyards. He walked through the empty kitchen, through a book-lined den. There was the door, but it was deadbolted. He cupped his hand to the glass. A striped canopy, a heap of dead leaves, the moon. No people. Yale turned and started shouting. Hello? Richard? Guys, hello? He went to the front door, also bizarrely deadbolted, and fumbled till it opened. There was no one on the dark street. The foggy, ridiculous idea came to him that the world had ended, that some apocalypse had swept through and forgotten only him. He laughed at himself, but at the same time, he saw no bobbing heads in neighbors' windows. There were lights in the houses opposite, but then the lights were on here, too. At the end of the block, the traffic signal turned from green to yellow to red. He heard the vague rush of cars far away, but that could have been the wind, couldn't it? Or even the lake. Yale hoped for a siren, a horn, a dog, an airplane across the night sky. Nothing. He went back inside and closed the door. He yelled again, "You guys!" And he felt now that a trick was being played, that they might jump out and laugh. But this was a memorial, wasn't it? It wasn't the 10th grade. People weren't always looking for ways to hurt him. He found his own reflection in Richard's TV. He was still here, still visible. On the back of a chair was a blue windbreaker he recognized as Asher glasses, the pockets empty. He should leave, but where would he even go? Cigarette butts filled the ashtrays. None were half smoked, none smashed out in haste. Copies of some of Nico's comics had been laid out on the end tables, the bar, but now they were scattered, probably more a product of the party than its end, and Yale plucked one off the floor. A drag queen named Martina Luther Kink, a silly punchline about having a dream. He walked through every room on the ground floor, opening every door, pantry, coat closet, vacuum closet, until he was greeted with a wall of cold air and descending cement steps. He found the light switch and made his way down. Laundry machines, boxes, 2 rusty bikes. He climbed back up and then all the way to the 3rd floor, a study, a little weight room, some storage, and then down to the 2nd again and opened everything. Ornate mahogany bureaus, canopy beds, a master bedroom all white and green, a Diane Arbus print on the wall, the one of the boy with the hand grenade. A telephone sat next to Richard's bed, and Yale grabbed it with relief. He listened to the tone, reassuring, and slowly dialed his own number. No answer. He needed to hear a voice, any human voice, and so he got the dial tone back and called information. "Name and city, please," the woman said. "Hello?" He wanted to make sure she wasn't a recording. "This is information. Do you know the name of the person you wish to call?" "Yes, it's Marcus. Nico Marcus on North Clark in Chicago." He spelled the names. "I have an N. Marcus on North Clark. Would you like me to connect you?" No, thank you." "Stay on the line for the number." Yale hung up. He circled the house one more time and went, finally, to the front door. He called to no one, "I'm leaving, I'm going," and stepped out into the dark. Okay, so the world is not over because there are 300 more pages. I did read this once at a conference that included some lovely younger writers, and this girl, I think was maybe in high school, came up to me. The book was not out yet, so I was just reading that first chapter. And she came up and she was very excited because she thought I was writing sci-fi, which is what she wrote, and that something with aliens had happened, and I had to break it to her. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you something I've only read once before in public. This thing happens because this book has been out almost 2 years. You get really sick of your own voice, reading the same things again and again. And I thought that I'd found all the sort of excerptable sections that would make sense out of context. And then I was doing a reading race recently, and the guy I was up on stage with asked for this section, and I realized this is a new one. So this means I'm going to stumble more, but I'm going to be less horrified at the sound of my own voice. So that's the payoff. And I'm also going to forget all the things I have to tell you for this to make sense. But basically, Nico's little sister is named Fiona. And we meet her in that first chapter. She's 21 years old, and she's kind of daffy and young and kind of wants to help everyone and ends up messing everything up. And we're 30 years later now. It's 2015, so she's 51. And we are in Paris, and she is there. Long story that I swear has something to do with the rest of the book, but she's estranged from her daughter who joined a cult and was last seen in Paris, and that's why she's there. Don't worry about it. And the last time her daughter was seen, there was a video of her on this one bridge called Pont de l'Archevêché, so it's like Bridge of the Archbishop in Paris, one of the smaller bridges there. And she's hired a private detective. She's doing what she can, but she's just sort of at loose ends, and she's wandering back there. And what else do you need to know? She and her brother were from Highland Park, up in the suburbs. There's going to be random stuff that I'll have to tell you as we go. Okay. Fiona covered as much ground as she could that afternoon, figuring that even if Claire was no longer in Paris, someone who'd known her when she had been here could be helpful. She tried art supply stores, yoga studios, every vaguely approachable person on the sidewalk. Shrugs, sympathetic smiles, confusion. 2 people took pictures of the photo with their phones, copied down her number. She ought to be back in the States, where Claire was most likely to be. She ended up back on Pont de l'Archevêché, mostly empty again. Sections of it were still covered in padlocks, as they'd been in the video. But some panels of chain link had been cleared and covered with plywood. Do you guys know that people do this thing, like they'll do a big padlock with their initials on it, except then it's like structurally breaking all the bridges because it weighs thousands of pounds, which is a really bad idea. A giant heart sticker was affixed to the sidewalk, an English message printed in white on the red. Our bridges can no longer withstand your gestures of love. In the heart's right atrium, a crossed-out lock. On the other side of the bridge, a man leaned over to stare at the tour boat passing below. She rested her back against the railing, facing not the water, not Notre Dame, but the width of the bridge itself. It was a cold day, foggy and damp. How long could she stand here, waiting and watching, before someone worried she was a suicide? When no other pedestrians were on the bridge, she called Claire's name down the river, Claire is her daughter, because it wouldn't do any good, and wasn't it nice for a change to do something she knew would do no good? She was tired and hungry again. She needed to get back to the apartment and call Damien, her ex, before it was too late in the States. She needed to call the store and make sure Susan was running everything smoothly. She shouted for Claire 10 times. It felt like a lucky number. Beginning in 5th grade, Fiona was in the habit of taking the train nearly every Saturday to see Nico, while her parents thought she was at Girl Scouts. So Nico was a few years older than her, and his parents had kicked him out when he came out, or when they discovered actually that he was gay. He didn't come out to them. And so she's still up in Highland Park with her parents. He's living with a bunch of roommates in Boys Town. Beginning in 5th grade, Fiona was in the habit of taking the train nearly every Saturday to see Nico, while her parents thought she was at Girl Scouts. The leaders never cared if you showed up, so she made sure to put in just enough appearances, the first meeting of the year, the last, the field trips, that she remained on the troop's roster. But most Saturdays she'd take the metro to Evanston, and then the L all the way down to Belmont. She'd carry a backpack filled with things she'd filched from the cupboards and refrigerator up in Highland Park. Half a carton of cottage cheese, a stick of butter, leftover chili, a sleeve of Ritz. Spoons once, when Nico didn't have enough. Items from his room, so slowly her parents wouldn't notice. Socks, photographs, tapes. She wished she could bring his records, but they wouldn't fit in her backpack. And besides, his roommates seemed to have plenty. It dawned on her only years later that they hadn't needed any of the things she'd brought, not really. They could have stolen spoons from a restaurant. Between them, they could have afforded food. There were 5 of them, sometimes 6 or 7, living in one room above a bar on Broadway, almost all of them teenagers. She found out only years later, as Nico was dying, that some of them had been hustling. Nico had a job bagging groceries, and between that money and Aunt Nora's money and the few dollars Fiona managed to sneak him, she'd steal change all week to pay for her train tickets, give him what was left. She managed to stay off the streets. At least this was what he'd maintained to the end. She didn't imagine he'd tell her, though, because then she'd have felt it was her fault, that she hadn't done enough, back when she was only a kid and was doing all she could. She would knock on the door, and he'd fling it open and say, "Thief the thief!" and scoop her inside. It was Christmas every time, watching him open the backpack, remove the items one by one. His roommates would crowd behind him, cheer for things like the spoons. Once she managed a bottle of wine. They couldn't believe it. One of them, was it Jonathan Bird, made up a song about her. She wished she could remember it. Nico had his own place by the time she moved to the city after high school, but a lot of those guys were still around, still called her Fief the Thief, loved to tell those stories right in front of her. This kid was Robin Hood, they'd say. James, Rodney, Jonathan. She might not have remembered Jonathan Bird, except that he was the very first to die. So early that he didn't die of AIDS, because there was no such acronym. He died of GRID. The G stood for gay, and she'd blocked out the rest. Jonathan had been healthy one day, and the next he had a cough, and a week later he was in the hospital, and the next day he was gone. It hadn't occurred to Fiona till just now, her hands gripping the cold bridge railing, that her mother might have known where she was going all those weekends, all those years. As she got older, when Girl Scouts wasn't a legitimate excuse, she'd made up stories about skating parties, study sessions. Maybe her mother had left her purse unguarded for a reason. As she called Claire's name one last time into the wind, as the city returned her voice on the wet air, Fiona remembered her mother calling for Nico in the yard when they were kids. Had she ever stopped calling for him? Had she ever stopped leaving coins around, hoping they'd find their way to her boy? After Nico died, their mother spent 20 years drinking. Fiona knew she was crushed, but she couldn't forgive her. They had done this to Nico, her mother and father. Her mother had stood there, crying, arms crossed, the night their father kicked Nico out, but she hadn't done a thing to stop him. She hadn't even given him any money. She'd gone and found his duffel bag in the basement, as if that were a favor. Over the years, Fiona visited them less and less. She withheld Claire. And maybe Claire would have been better if she'd had grandparents, a safety net, extended family. Our bridges can no longer withstand your gestures of love. Well, fuck. She peeled her fingers from the railing. She walked back to Richard's, climbed the stairs toward the smell of browning garlic. So I'll stop there. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming, everyone.